Welcome back to Dirt Obsession, everyone. New and interesting news in the ATV market has been pretty few and far between for the last few years. We'd like to blame COVID and stagnant economies, as so often is the standard excuse for stale markets, but that's just not the case when you look at other power sports categories like side-by-sides or adventure motorcycles. This hits a little different for fans of ATVs like us, because every year that passes without any meaningful releases in the ride-on ATV segment sees more folks overlooking the fun and versatility of an ATV in favor of the more familiar, more expensive, and far less fun option of a side-by-side. To say that the 4x4 ATV market has peaked is probably an unfortunately fair statement. 4x4 ATVs have simply suffered too many blows from other categories of power sports and have been neutered by restrictive emissions policies that add significant expense and cause manufacturers to be conservative with their lineups. That's not to say we'll never see a new 4x4 ATV. In fact, Kawasaki is currently hinting at an ATV release that'll be unveiled when the curtain drops on June 7th. We're keeping our fingers crossed, and we'll look back at what Kawasaki might be releasing later in the video. But for now, let's take a look at the 2023 Kawasaki Brute Force 750. This is a machine we've been criticized for not giving the proper attention it deserves on an ATV channel. But in fairness, Kawasaki doesn't give it the attention it deserves either. They rarely market the Brute Force. They've never included it in a video in the 8-year lifespan of the Kawasaki USA YouTube channel, and the last press event they held was the last time it received a meaningful update, 11 years ago for the 2012 model year. So the Brute Force is due for an update, but that doesn't mean that it's not still a great option in the 4x4 ATV market, because it absolutely is. And that's a testament to how well Kawasaki did on the Brute in their last update. The 749cc V-twin single overhead cam engine makes about 50 horsepower, which is down on horsepower compared to the 850cc ATVs from Polaris and Can-Am, but the power of the Brute is right where you want it on a 4x4 ATV. It punches hard in the low range, and it pulls hard in the mid-range, and it's definitely more power than can be fully utilized on the trails. Power is one area where the Brute Force separates itself from its closest competition in both the Yamaha Grizzly 700 and the Suzuki Kingwad 750. Despite the V-twin engine, the Brute Force is about 100 pounds lighter than the base model Sportsman 850 at 699 pounds with all the fluid, which makes the Brute feel more agile on the trails. The seating position has you into the Brute more so than on the Can-Am Outlanders, which is my personal preference in ergonomics because it's much more confidence-inspiring to me to feel lower into the machine, although I should also say the midsection is still a little blocky to make room for the motor and the side-mounted CVT. Stock tires are 25 inches, which contribute to a lower center of gravity, but it does sacrifice some ground clearance at a just okay 9.4 inches. A few other things I like about the Brute Force is the steel racks with plenty of tie-down points. Having had composite racks on a few machines, I think I'll always prefer steel racks. They just seem to work in more applications in my opinion. I also like the overall look of the Brute Force. It's simple but effective in its tough, almost utilitarian style. I like the look of not having a headlight pod, even though I do prefer to actually have one because they're irreplaceable when you're riding in the dark. And the stock exhaust sound, as Mike Lester from Dirt Track so eloquently put it,
honestly should be downloadable on iTunes.
Is really good. Good God, that's a good looking dude. Unfortunately, Kawasaki has succumbed to the price increases that we've seen from almost all other manufacturers this year. The 2022 Brute Force 750s were listed at $9,999, and for 2023, that price jumped to $11,399. Anyway, for all its strengths, there's still some issues that could easily be fixed. True 4x4 with diff lock is a strong point, but the diff lock lever is ancient technology at this point. The original Prairie 650 had the same system back in 2002. The problem is you have to hold the lever to keep the diff lock engaged, which is easy for short-term application, but a button is much easier. The lighting sucks too. 2 small headlights are 35 watts, and you really notice the lack of a light pod after dark. And lastly, the suspension makes for a fairly stiff and rigid ride when compared to a Polaris, Yamaha, or Suzuki. All in all, those are pretty minor gripes against a machine that has stood the test of time. As with any machine that's been around for a while, if you look hard enough, you can find examples of failure. On the Brute Force, there's been some history of engine failure, fan malfunctions, and issues with the 4x4 system. None of that would make me hesitate to buy one though, because there are tons of examples of brute forces with ridiculously high mileage claims, some surpassing 50,000, which is just insane for an ATV. So far, the only recent change in the 2023 brute force is that Kawasaki dropped the non-EPS version last year, and this year, they're painting the racks. I mean, they aren't even updating the photo gallery on their website. No EPS in the lineup is no big deal in my opinion. If I were getting a brute force, I'd definitely be getting the EPS version. Yamaha made a similar move with the Grizzly a few years ago, so I think buyers in this market just expect power steering at this point. Other than that, no significant changes since 2012, which leads me to the point of this video. Isn't it about time Kawasaki freshens up? Yamaha made a few revisions to the Grizzly 700 in 2016 and then again in 2019. The King Quad got some revisions and a facelift in 2019, and the latest version of the Sportsman 850 1000 design was from 2017. Only Honda's Rincon 680 is more dated. But it's not even fair to compare the brute force to the Rincon, because the brute force is the far superior machine in every way. But it does seem like the brute force is due for some attention. Since I do like the style of the brute, I'd personally be happy with some suspension improvements, and maybe some better stock wheels and tires and an upgraded package. But at the same time, I also like that Kawasaki hasn't bolted a bunch of stuff to the brute for the sake of a price hike like Polaris and Can-Am have with their big bore machines. However, I think Kawasaki has done a nice job with the Terex 800 LE by adding Fox Performance shocks and stock Bighorn tires. Leveraging those relationships with Fox and Maxxis would make for a nice brute force package while still keeping the price relatively in check. They can keep the bumpers and extra lights and some of the other frills that primarily serve to drive the price point up further. So what do you think? Is the brute force still relevant, or does it need an upgrade? Perhaps more importantly, what do you think Kawasaki plans on bringing to the ATV market in June? There's been rumors for a few years about a mid-displacement ATV from Kawasaki, maybe in the 450 to 500cc class. I personally think that's the most likely reveal we'll see in June, but I know a lot of ATV fans are going to be screaming for a 1000cc brute. I really don't see that happening though, and I honestly don't think trail riding is very taxing on power, so the 750 brute force has plenty of power for its intended use. I think a reasonably priced, mid-displacement ATV is going to be more approachable for most people, and we know that's the class of machines with the highest market demand. But I want to hear what you think. Is Kawasaki going to surprise everyone with a 1000cc brute force? And would you be ready to drop 12 to 13 grand on one if they did? Thanks for checking out the video, guys. We'll see you next time on Dirt Obsession.